Okay, in this second video on the English parry, I want to talk about the effects of distance on how you parry and how you can parry. And I want to start with a quote from Sweetnam. On page 5 of chapter 1, he says, "But I say there is great odds betwixt fighting in the field and playing in a fence school. For in the field, being both sober, I mean, if it be in a morning upon cold blood, then every man will as much fear to kill as to be killed. Again, a man shall see to defend either blow or thrust in the field than in fence school. For a man will be more bold with a foil or a cudgel, because there is small danger in either of them. But when they come to tell their tale at the point of a rapier, they will stand off for their own safety." So what Sweetnam is saying is that in a real fight, people will stand further apart than they typically do in a fencing school. Hope says much the same thing. He states that there are 3 distances in rapier or more small sword fighting. Now, Hope's weapon can either be described as a late rapier or an early small sword. He writes, this is the first distance, the first whereof is when a man is so near to his adversary that he can reach him without elonging or stepping out, by only stretching out his sword arm and inclining forwards with his body, without moving in the least his advanced foot. No good swordman who regards his own safety will make use of this kind of measure, because it obliges him to be so very near to his adversary that he may readily be surprised by him, either by a quick plain thrust, a subtle feint, or a sudden commanding. And that's from page 122. The second kind of measure, or distance, which is, as it were, a medium betwixt the first, which needs no stepping out, and the third distance, which is always performed by approaching or advancing, although not constantly by stepping out or elonging. This second kind of measure is that which is most commonly made use of by good swordmen, especially those who regard their own security when they have an occasion with sharps. For this obliges their adversary to come to half sword, as we say, whereby a man's true skill and dexterity is a great deal better discovered, especially in the defensive part, than it is possible for it to be when playing at the third kind of distance, or without distance, as is commonly termed in the schools. The third kind of measure is that wherein a man is necessitated to advance a step or two, yea, sometimes more, before he can reach his adversary. And Hope goes on later on the page to state that at the third distance, a man is very much disordered by approaching, and he is liable to be surprised by the advancing motions of his adversary. So both Sweetnam and Hope have described that people, under the duress of being in a real fight, will stand as far as they possibly can away from the opponent's rapier. And this isn't what they do in fencing schools, that they will stand too far away to fence properly. Now, Hope concludes by saying that of the 3 above mentioned distances, the first is the most dangerous. I think everyone knows that. The third the next best, and the second the most secure of all 3, being that which is generally made use of by the greatest swordmen by reason of its great benefit and use in an occasion with sharps. So, what's the significance? Hope says that no good swordsman will use the first distance, will fight from within distance, and that's pretty basic. Silver says much the same thing. If 2 people stand within distance, they're going to be able to hit each other, and the first mover will tend to have an advantage. What is interesting here is that Hope is saying that it's actually more dangerous to be at the third distance, to be further out of distance, than it is to be in the middle distance where you can engage at the half sword. Why would this be so? Why would it be more dangerous to be further away from your opponent? Surely that doesn't make sense. What Hope says is that when you're at a really wide distance, then you tend to attack with multiple steps, often with, we see descriptions in many manuals of people leaping in as they attack, and frankly I've seen that a lot in rapier fencing. People doing great big, almost leaping attacks from way outside distance. What effect does this have on your parry? If you're in the second distance and somebody attacks you, most commonly they have to disengage because your swords are crossed, and that means that you have the time of the disengagement to react and to prepare your response, and that by the time their sword is coming towards you, it's still moving relatively slowly and is relatively easy to cross, particularly if you're doing it in the manner of a lot of continental systems where you're crossing at a low angle and at times thrusting with opposition. And we'll show an example of that taken from Saviolo's system, and we'll show that now. If we look at the same action but from the third distance, from a wider distance, we can see that it is very, very, very different. What I'm about to show you now is the same action you just saw. Well, I'm going to be attempting to make the same action, and we'll see how successful that is when the attack comes from the third distance. So obviously that action wasn't anywhere near as successful when done from the third distance. Why wasn't it as successful? Well, the reason is that when the action's done from the second distance, we've got the time of the disengage, and the weapon, the attacking weapon, by the time the defender can make an action on the blade, the attacking weapon is still moving quite slowly. It's quite a sure mark. If the attack comes in from really wide distance, okay, we know there's an attack, but by the time an action can be made on the attacking blade is moving very, very rapidly and is a very uncertain mark for your action, whether that be a parry or a counter thrust with opposition. Okay, so we've seen that the same action can be effective when done in what Hope describes as the second distance, but can be ineffective or only marginally effective when done at the third distance. We've also seen that several authors claim that people who are under the duress of being in a real fight will typically fight at a wider distance. They'll fight at this unsafe distance, believing themselves to be safer because they're further away from the nasty pointy thing in the other guy's hand. So what effect does this have on how you parry? What I'm going to be arguing in the final video is I'm going to be looking at discussions that the English authors made of the continental style parries where the weapons were at a low angle rather than at a 90-degree angle, were at a low angle to each other, the effect this had on parrying, and why this made parrying at a 90-degree angle superior.